I think everything changed with the weaponization of the US semiconductor industry against China. If you recall, back in 2018, President Trump said, forget the trade war, we're moving into a tech war. We're basically going to tell every semiconductor company around the world that they're no longer allowed to sell semiconductors to Huawei and ZTE in China unless, then they lose the US market. So you're going to have to choose, either you deal with the Chinese or you deal with us. This was, a massive upending of the, frankly, the global industrial order. It marked the genuine end of globalization. Because then if you're China, all of a sudden you have to build your own semiconductor industry. And you have to think, okay, the US is out to get me. How do I protect myself? I have a number of weaknesses. I'm vulnerable on the semiconductor front. I'm vulnerable on the energy front. I'm vulnerable on the agricultural front. Now, part of the end result of being vulnerable on the energy front is China gets a lot closer to Russia, because Russia can solve that for China. If China all of a sudden feels the US is out to get me, I have now to jump in bed with Russia. And even if Putin does unpleasant things, I'll just have to grin and bear it. And so, yes, we've seen since 2018, as you point out, you first have Trump, who weaponizes the semiconductor industry. And then indeed, following the Ukraine invasion, the Western world weaponizes its entire financial system against Russia. And, we confiscate the Russian central bank reserves. We confiscate the assets of every Russian oligarch in the Western world, be it, houses in Saint-Tropez or mega yachts or private jets or whatever else. We just take those. And Russia's response indeed is to weaponize energy, to say, well, Europe, if you're going to take my money, then I'm not going to sell you my gas anymore. What's the point of me selling you gas if when you give me euros, then those euros get confiscated? There's no point in me doing that. So now all of a sudden, the end result of all this weaponization of everything is you end up with supply chain dislocations, such as we've seen in the auto industry and in the consumer electronic industry because of the weaponization of semiconductors. And that has an impact on markets and has an impact on prices, an impact on inflation, and an impact on corporate margins. And now we see the energy crisis in Europe. So we, had the supply chain crisis. Now we have the energy crisis, and the energy crisis is going to lead to another wave of supply chain dislocations. So yes, all of a sudden geopolitics matter, and they matter a whole lot. It's not something you can fade like you used to.
If the game has sort of changed going forward, what do you think the biggest implications of this are going to be? So it sounds like you're saying, at least in the near to midterm, we're going to continue to have these inflationary supply chain disruptions. So I take it from that comment that you don't think disinflation is going to be all that big of a factor in the near term. And how about just sort of like the balance of power going forward? Is China now on a much more, tightened path with Russia here to work with the rest of the BRICS to try to become less dependent upon the West? You're nodding a little bit as I'm saying this, and I'm just tossing it out there as a potential one. So you tell me what you think.
Well, I think there's so many different avenues you can go down, but the first and most obvious one that we have to acknowledge is globalization is over, right? So we've lived through 20 years of globalization, and that globalization was profoundly disinflationary. Now, I think, 3, 4, 5 years ago, the big debates I was having with a lot of clients and people were having everywhere was, what has been the key force behind the past 2 or 3 decades worth of what was then disinflation/deflation? Was it the demographic transition? Was it globalization? Was it technology? I think we now know. The answer is obvious. It was globalization, because we're still getting older. Yeah. We still have technology. Like Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook didn't disappear. The one thing that has changed in the world in the past few years is we've moved from globalization to deglobalization. And guess what's happened? Inflation has moved up meaningfully. In fact, inflation today in pretty much every Western country is either at generational highs or even sometimes at all-time highs, or at least at post-World War II highs. Now, which brings me to my next point. I think when you look at the history, my friend Vincent Deluire of StoneX made this point recently on one of our podcasts, and he's made this point on many podcasts. And if your listeners don't follow Vincent Deluire on Twitter, they should. He's made a very good point, which is that inflation is inflationary, i.e., and just like deflation feeds on itself, which is why central banks try to cut it out before it really gets out of hand, inflation also tends to feed on itself. And so if you look at, and he's done this study where you look at all the episodes across major markets since World War II where inflation moved above 5%. And the point was, let's look at inflation above 5% and how many times did it roll over and go back below 2% within the following 2 years. And the answer was without interest rates absolutely crushing the economy, without basically having to raise interest rates and having a massive recession. You know, how many times, and out of 50 different times, it happened once. So, 2%.
Okay.
and the more likely scenario is that the inflation keeps feeding on itself until you crush through massively high real rates, until you crush it through massive. So the end result is, why should we believe that inflation is over when policymakers have yet to really tighten fiscal policy in any meaningful way and have yet to tighten monetary policy in any meaningful way? And the answer is it doesn't.
If you enjoyed this video clip, click here to watch another one you should like.